Welcome to the 6th video in our series on traditional approaches to cost assignment. In this video, we continue to look at methods of inter-service department reallocations. Specifically, this video deals with the repeated distribution method. This method is also sometimes referred to as the reciprocal method. Let us consider our learning objectives for this video. As with our previous video, we will begin by revising the underlying workings of the departmental overhead rates. Once we have done this, we will continue with the same example we have been using in our previous videos, this time using the repeated distribution method to allocate our service department overheads to the production departments. A quick recap of how departmental overhead rates work. In our previous video on allocating the overhead costs to the departments, we focused on steps 1 to 3, which took us through determining the total manufacturing overhead cost, identifying the separate departments, and ended with us allocating our overheads to the departments in the factory. In this video, we will again be focusing on steps 4 to 7, which look at the reallocation of service departments, the calculation of the departmental overhead rates, and the allocation to the products. This is just a reminder of the different methods we have for inter-service department reallocations. In our previous 2 videos, we have looked at the direct allocation method and the specified order of closing method. This video will look at the repeated distribution method. Then our next video will look at the simultaneous equation method. What we will see over the course of this video and the next is that the repeated distribution and simultaneous equation methods actually give us the identical answer. So what is the basic idea with the repeated distribution method? Essentially, the service departments are repeatedly allocated to each department, including the other service departments, based on the usage of the service department until such time that the amount left to be allocated becomes too small. So we repeatedly allocate the service department overheads until they eventually disappear. Importantly, because we just keep reallocating, the order in which we allocate the departments does not matter. Let us have a look at our example to see how this method works in practice. Remember, this first paragraph tells us that our factory has 2 production departments, namely cutting and assembly, and 2 service departments, namely procurement and maintenance. We are then presented with 2 tables. The first table provides us with our overhead costs for the factory in total, while the second table provides us with some basic information about each department, which we used in our previous video to allocate the overhead costs to the departments. We are then provided with the required, where we need to value this product. Notice at the end, now it tells us that we need to apply the repeated distribution method for inter-service department reallocations. Now remember in video 3 of the series, we allocated out the overheads to the various departments. If you can't remember how we arrived at the numbers on screen, please go back and watch the video on allocating overheads to the departments. Our next step then is to allocate our service departments, which were procurement and maintenance, to our production departments of cutting and assembly. For the repeated distribution method, remember that the order we allocate the service departments in does not matter. For the purposes of this example, I will start with the procurement department. But if you want, you could start with maintenance. The answer will be the same. Now notice a major difference in this table compared to the previous methods we have looked at. I no longer have just one row to allocate out procurement and just one row to allocate out maintenance. Rather, I have multiple rows for each department. This is because when I allocate out procurement, some overheads will be allocated to maintenance. Then I will allocate out maintenance, but some overheads will be reallocated back to the procurement department. So I need to continue this process of reallocating out the 2 service departments until such point that the amount becomes immaterial. This now is a very repetitive process, so I'll go through the first steps in detail and we will then go a bit faster. Remember that we need to allocate the service departments based on the other department's usage. If you have watched our previous videos, you should remember that procurement relates to the purchasing of goods and services, and so we selected raw material orders as our means of allocation. So now we need to allocate procurement to the cutting, assembly, and maintenance departments. So 50 out of 100, which is the total, will go to cutting. 35 out of 100 will go to assembly, and 15 out of 100 will go to maintenance. Notice how we have allocated the full 98,000 Rand to our cutting, assembly, and maintenance departments. If we add the 49,000, the 34,300 Rand, and the 14,700 Rand, we arrive back at the total of the procurement department of 98,000 Rand. Now note that the procurement department has been allocated out and has no overheads left in it. But unlike the specified order of closing method, in the repeated distribution method, we do not close a department once it has been allocated out. Rather, we keep it open and allow the other service department overheads to be allocated back to that department. Also notice that the overheads in the maintenance department are no longer just the initial amount of 70,500. We have also allocated an extra allocation of 14,700 Rand, so the total overheads now in the maintenance department is 85,200 Rand, which now needs to be allocated out. Now remember, in our previous video, we determined that maintenance hours was the best method to allocate out our maintenance department. For the repeated distribution method, the maintenance department needs to be allocated to cutting, assembly, and procurement. This is very important to note. We are going to allocate some of the maintenance department overheads back to the procurement department. So now we need to allocate the overhead as 350 out of 1,000 to our cutting department, 500 out of 1,000 to our assembly department, and 150 out of 1,000 to our procurement department. Now for the maintenance department, remember that we are allocating out the original overheads of 70,500 plus the allocation from the procurement department of 14,700 Rand, which gives us our total of 85,200. Notice what has happened. Our maintenance department is now empty. However, our procurement department has 12,780 Rands worth of overheads in it. Notice how the reallocation gets smaller and smaller each time. Eventually, this amount will be insignificant. However, until this happens, we need to repeat this process of allocating out the service departments again and again. This repeated allocation of the service departments gives this method its name. So we now have to reallocate out the overheads of 12,780 Rand from the procurement department. Again, we are going to use raw material orders to allocate out the procurement department. We therefore use the same proportions we used earlier, of 50 out of 100 for cutting, 35 out of 100 for assembly, and 15 over 100 for maintenance. Again, our procurement department is empty, but our maintenance department now has a balance of 1,917 Rand. This amount needs to be allocated again, so we repeat the process and allocate out maintenance. For the maintenance department reallocation, we again use maintenance hours. We use the same proportions of 350 over 1,000 for cutting, 500 over 1,000 for assembly, and 150 over 1,000 for procurement. Again, our maintenance department is empty, but behold, our procurement department now has a balance of 287 Rand. This amount needs to be allocated out. So we repeat the process, allocating out our procurement department. Again, we use raw material orders to allocate our procurement department in the same proportions we have used previously. Once again, we end up with a procurement department that has no overheads in it, but maintenance department now has a balance of 43 Rand. The amount has significantly reduced from how it began. To allocate out the 43 Rand, we continue to use the maintenance hours for the maintenance department. Again, our maintenance department is empty, but procurement now has a balance of 6 Rand. This amount needs to be allocated again, and you will notice that this has become a very repetitive process. We repeat and we allocate out the 6 Rand using our proportions for raw material orders. Again, our procurement department is empty, but our maintenance department now has a balance of 1 Rand. This amount is very small, and as I have been rounding to the nearest rand all along, the amount will disappear and be insignificant in the next allocation. So let us allocate out the maintenance department one last time. We now reallocate the 1 rand from the maintenance department using the same proportions of 350 over 1000 for cutting, 500 over 1000 for assembly, and 150 over 1000 for procurement. However, notice that because of rounding, I have allocated the entire amount to the assembly department. Nothing has been allocated to the procurement department. Now, both our service departments are empty, and we can end this process. If you are using this approach in practice, you may decide that the amount in the service departments were insignificant at an earlier point, in which case you would have allocated out the department one last time and ended the repetitive process at that point. Alternatively, to avoid this repetition, you could use the simultaneous equation method, which we will look at in our next video. We can now total our departments. We see that cutting has a total of 235,543 rand, while assembly has a total of 362,457 rand. Notice that both our service departments have 0 overheads in them. We have thus allocated all our overheads out of our service departments and into our production departments. Also notice that if we add the cutting department overheads and the assembly department overheads, we arrive at our total overheads of 598,000 rand. Our next step now is to identify our driver for each production department. Remember from our previous video, we have already seen that cutting is labor intensive and we need to use direct labor hours, while assembly is capital intensive and we need to use machine hours. So we can fill in our cost drivers, and we can divide our total overheads for each department by the cost driver for each department to arrive at our separate overhead rates for each department of 5 rand and 89 cents per direct labor hour for cutting and 9 rand and 54 cents per machine hour for assembly. So remember then, our goal was to cost this product. Remember, our basic format is the direct material cost plus the direct labor cost to give us our prime cost. We then add our variable and fixed overheads to arrive at our total cost. In this example, we do not have variable overheads. Take a moment now to pause this video and see if you can calculate the product cost on your own. Now, our direct materials and direct labor are fairly straightforward. You should remember that we calculated the total prime cost of 220 rand in our previous videos. This will not change between the reallocation methods, so I'll rather focus on the fixed overheads. When allocating the overheads to the product, it doesn't matter which order we do this, so I will again start with the cutting department. Remember that the cutting department is labor intensive, so we want to ignore the machine hours and only consider the labor hours of 5 direct labor hours. The 5 direct labor hours in the cutting department then need to be multiplied by the cutting department's overhead rate, which we calculated earlier at 5 rand and 89 cents per direct labor hour. Notice we are matching the 5 direct labor hours used in the cutting department with the 5 rand and 89 cents per direct labor hour for the cutting department. This gives us our overhead allocation for the cutting department of 29 rand and 45 cents per unit. Now we move on to the assembly department. Remember, we determined that this department was capital intensive and the overhead allocation rate was per machine hour. Therefore, in the assembly department, we ignore our labor hours and we are only concerned with our 7 machine hours. The 7 machine hours in the assembly department then need to be multiplied by the assembly department's overhead rate, which we calculated earlier at 9 rand and 54 cents per machine hour. Notice we are matching the 7 machine hours used in the assembly department with the 9 rand and 54 cents per machine hour for the assembly department. This gives us our overhead allocation for assembly of 66 rand and 78 cents per unit. We can then finish off our example by adding the overhead costs to the prime cost to arrive at a total cost of 316 Rand and 23 cents per unit. In our next video, we will look at how this example would have differed had we used the simultaneous equation method. See you next time.